and the soldier and poet. Yes, tell this to all the world.
Hey, welcome to the Pod Sound School. I'm Studio Steve. I'm an audio engineer and a big-time podcast nerd, and also your host for today's episode. I'm not going to be accompanied by my usual co-host, Veronica, your favorite host. So for that, I apologize in advance, but I'm going to make up for it with a really valuable episode for you today. And I'm titling it,
The 5 Must-Use Plugins on Every Podcast Mix.
So as you may guess, and if you've listened to any of our episodes or watched any of our content before, you know that I'm really passionate about audio production. It's why we started the Pod Sound School. And very early on when we were developing the Pod Sound School, we knew it was going to be very difficult to explain some of these audio production principles in audio form. So we knew we were going to need a YouTube channel so that you could actually see some of this stuff to learn it and to understand how it works. So we actually haven't done a lot of episodes where I really dive deep into the audio production stuff. So I thought it would actually be very helpful to just have a chat with you like I would a fellow podcast editor or one of our students who's wondering what plugins they should use on their podcast mixes without going into so much detail about how the plugins actually work. So I would really recommend that you do learn how each one of these plugins work, but I'm not going to spend this episode talking about like the nuts and bolts and the behind the scenes of how the plugins work. I will tell you the settings that I use on the plugins on every podcast mix, but I'm not really going to take too much time explaining how it works because this is actually my 4th take at this episode. And in the first few takes, I went off on way too long just on the very first plugin, compression. And so let's start there. And at the end of this episode, I'm going to actually tell you where you can get all of these plugins all in one place for a very affordable price that will work with any DAW or audio editing software you're using, whether it's GarageBand, Audacity, Reaper, Pro Tools. They can all use these plugins. So stick around till the end of the episode for those recommendations, and let's just get to it.
Number 1, compression.
I love compression. I could seriously just talk about it all day. I don't know why I love it so much. Is it because it's the most used tool in audio production? Is it because it makes me feel important that I know about it? Is it because I use it all the time? What is it? But it is absolutely, if you were only going to use one plugin on your podcast mixes, it would be the one you want to use. Now, a question that I get all the time too is what's the difference between a compressor and a limiter? Don't go there because a limiter is number 5 on the list. Spoiler. But let's just quickly talk about what's called a dynamic range compressor, which is what we're talking about when we say compression in audio production. It's called that because what it does is it reduces the dynamic range. So when we're talking about dynamic range, we're talking about softness versus loudness. We're talking about absolute silence and the whole range between that and absolute loudness. One of the most dynamic instruments in music, for example, would be the voice, or any acoustic instrument tends to be very dynamic. So an acoustic guitar, an acoustic piano, there's just so many different levels of loudness of how we can play those instruments. Same with speech. We talk quiet sometimes, then we get excited and we laugh and we get super loud to where the dynamic range is huge. So one thing that a lot of radio hosts and performers and content creators will kind of try to train themselves to do is to work with microphone technique and work on keeping their voice less dynamic just themselves to improve their performance. But compression comes to the rescue because it does exactly that. It makes what's louder quieter, and it makes what's quieter louder. It reduces the dynamic range, a dynamic range compressor. And it's really magic how it works. And we have a video on YouTube where I talk about each of the elements inside of a compressor and how you can use each one intentionally. And if you don't want to take the time to learn how a compressor actually works, all of these plugins that you can get from any developer, most of them, I should say, have presets. So you can just open up the compressor, go to a preset, and there will be a preset on there that says gentle vocal compressor or voice compressor or female voice compressor or even podcast voice on some of these awesome plugins. So my favorite plugin is any variation of the 1176. When I was first introduced to the 1176, it was Yuri. Now it's a universal audio plugin, and it's actually a physical piece of hardware, and it's beautiful and delicious. And The real 1176 in real life has tubes in it. And in addition to actually applying the compression and making what's louder, quieter, and what's quieter, louder, it also adds warmth and a certain quality to it that I like a lot. And it's also really cool for indie people who might not want to learn how it works because it only has a couple knobs on it. It has a knob that says input and a knob that says output. So anytime you see a big compressor plugin that has two big knobs that you can turn, and one says input and one says output, it's probably emulating one of these old classic style compressors. And those are really great and they do a great job. The other buttons you'll see are going to be your ratio buttons. And you don't really need to know exactly how a ratio works. It's pretty easy to understand and you should go check out the YouTube video. But it's a 4:1 ratio is what we're going to want to use on podcast voices and on voices in general. That's the most commonly used one. And that's why you will see a button on the 1176. You'll see a button that says 4, 8, 12, and 20. Those are all different ratios. And it stands for 4:1 or 8:1. And basically it just says,
anytime that the volume surpasses this line that I set, this threshold that I set,
which is determined by that input knob,
I'm going to bring that volume down at a 4:1 ratio.
And so if you have the compressor set to the very kind of high midpoint of how you speak, when you're just naturally speaking, the compressor isn't going to really apply that reduction. But when you get loud, it will apply a reduction only when you get loud. That's what's so magic about it. And then because it has applied all that gain reduction and it's reduced the volume of your voice, it's going to need to boost it. So that's where we have the output knob or the gain knob or even the boost knob. You'll see it called sometimes on compressors. And that just makes up. Make up is the other way that you will hear it called. Make up, output, and gain. Those are the three ways that you'll most commonly see it called on a compressor. So you just strap one of those on every single one of your podcast voices. They're going to sound a little warmer. They're going to sound more controlled, more articulate. And you'll know if you've put a compressor on too heavy to a voice because it will start to sound kind of like too driven, almost like it's going through a guitar amp. And you'll hear all of the soft articulation. You'll hear the spit in the mouth like way too much. And you'll hear the insides of your nostrils. And so we don't want to overdo the compression. We want to have a nice, happy medium with the compression because we're going to continue to put another compressor on our whole podcast mix later when we get to number 5. But let's move on
to number 2, EQ.
Wait till I tell you everything.
Okay, now EQ is one that is probably the most bewildering of all of the plugins. It's the one that I know for me was the hardest to wrap my head around and the hardest to use, maybe the most scary to use. This is actually playing with the frequency of our sound. So dynamic plugins like compressors, they play with the dynamics, the loudness of our sound. But EQ plays with the frequencies or the color of our sound. And you just need to know that human hearing has basically from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. That's the spectrum. So now instead of a volume spectrum, we're working with an EQ spectrum. And much like they can graph the hertz of the piano, and they know that the middle C is like 440 hertz or something. I don't know if I'm getting that right. You can do that with sound as well. And this becomes so useful when we are producing our podcast mixes because there's a lot of just kind of go-to fixer-uppers you can do in the EQ using an EQ unit. And really, I'm not very picky when it comes to an EQ unit. I think any of the EQs, plugins that come with your DAWs are just fine. I love the ones that come with Pro Tools. The ones that come with Reaper are great as well. But I do like to get a nice, good quality sounding EQ. And I personally like to see a parametric EQ is what it's called, to where you can sometimes see the audio passing through it. And that can be helpful to get the visual of the audio. And it's when I got in to be able to see the visuals of that audio spectrum and being able to pull down the EQ up and down that I was able to understand it more. But basically, the only thing you really need to understand about EQ is that it allows you to sort of adjust the lows, mids, and highs. So if you've ever adjusted the lows, mids, and highs in a car stereo, and usually people do the smiley face, they boost the low and they boost the high because it just makes that bass rumble in your body. Well, it's the same thing with our podcast voice. And there's places where there's usually some problems or can be some problems. A common problem, for example, is in the high mid range. In that range would be the frequencies of that range would be anywhere from like 600 hertz, 500 hertz, all the way up to 1000 hertz. there's this mid-range kind of horn sound, and it's also where there happens to be a lot of reverb in a lot of our rooms. So if we make a little dip in that area, or we reduce the knob that's in control of that area, then we will lessen some of that reverb. Another thing that most EQs have, especially like a 7-band EQ, is they allow us to put a high-pass filter or a low-pass filter on. Those are really cool, especially high-pass filters. And I would say that a good portion of podcast editors apply a high-pass filter. It's so common, in fact, that you'll see a high-pass filter built into a ton of condenser microphones and even dynamic microphones. Sometimes on the back of a microphone, you'll see a switch. And on one side of the switch, there's a flat line. And then the other side of the switch, there's a line that slopes down to the left. That means high-pass filter, because that's actually what it's doing. It's making a slope at the low end and only allowing the high frequencies to pass through. So it's actually sort of opposite. That's how I remember it. A high-pass filter is going to cut off the low end of stuff. Now, human speech, our voices never really go down below 80 hertz. Some male voices might get there, but not really. You're never even going to need to worry about anything below 80 hertz. So if you have one of those on the back of your microphone, just pop that thing in there, and then maybe you don't even have to mess with EQ. Because EQ could be something that you might want to incorporate later, but I would just encourage not to be afraid of it and get in there and start playing around with them, and you'll understand them quicker than you would think. So in every podcast mix, I typically put on a high-pass filter, and I set it at 80 hertz, which means anything lower than 80 hertz will get rolled off, or the volume of anything lower than 80 hertz is just not going to be in the track anymore. And that's really helpful for something called plosives, which you probably just heard because I popped a P in the microphone. It can help with that a lot. And also the rumbles of trucks driving by, and just kind of sometimes some of the rumbles that we have in our room even that are way lower in frequency than our voice ever gets down to. Let's just roll that stuff off and not even have it in our podcast mix. It's just going to be mud. And then the other thing I'll do sometimes with EQs, I usually always like to give the low end a boost, especially with female voices. And I usually give them a boost around 250 hertz-ish. Now you will have to kind of sweep the EQ band a little bit. So you can spike up the EQ band, and you can actually turn that portion of the EQ band up so that you can hear what it sounds like if it were turned up. And that kind of gives you this opportunity to sweep through the EQ range to hear what sounds good and what doesn't, what you like and what you don't like. And so with each individual speaker, I will raise the EQ, I'll sweep a little bit, and I'll find that sweet spot, like with a female voice. So Veronica's voice, for example, it's always right around, I think it's actually with her like 170 hertz that I like to bump with her voice. So that's just something you could do, is find a little place. And especially if you have a female and a male speaking together, it could be nice to give the female a little more low end in her voice, and just makes it more warm and sounding nice. I also like to add a little low end to my voice because I think it makes me sound more manly.
And I have some sort of insecurity with that, apparently.
I think with EQ, less is more. And I'd usually try to coach anybody's project who I'm editing. I try to get better quality recordings, more natural sounding recordings, by treating the room or choosing different microphones or preamps or audio interfaces so that I can avoid doing EQ. Because I think EQ is almost better used as a corrective tool than it is as a flavoring tool, at least in most applications when it comes to podcasts. Music's a whole different thing, but we're not going to go there. We're making podcasts. So my favorite for that, again, is any EQ that's a 7-band or even a 4-band EQ. And that basically just means the different knobs that you have that you can select and change at what point in the frequency range you can adjust. You can either boost or reduce. And let's move on
To number 3, noise reduction.
Noise reduction is huge in podcast editing, especially, and also in film production. It's very highly used, and it's very important. Every podcast editor, professional podcast editor, is going to have noise reduction be one of the plugins, if not a whole series of plugins that they have on their mixes. Now, I have a favorite for this. It's a go-to, and I won't even have to spend that much time talking about it. It's called the NS1. And this is by Waves, and I'm going to get to that at the end, but it's called NS1. It has one knob, and you just turn the knob up a little bit. And as you turn it up, you hear the noise just magically go away. It's insane, and it's so cool. The other thing that I use actually when I'm using Pro Tools is I use the isotope. And I'm actually just using the RX7 version of isotope. I believe they're up to RX9 now. And isotope's amazing. It's used all the time, constantly in television and film production, and it can save performances that otherwise would not have been useful. And it has a whole series of plugins that come with the isotope collection when you purchase it. And that whole series of plugins is something called De-reverb, and that actually is sort of more of an EQ situation that's going on. It analyzes your track and reduces some EQ to try to get rid of the reverb. And it does so in kind of also utilizing compression style technology as well. It's really magic. And all of these different tools that allow you to actually analyze your track and then apply different types of noise reduction to it. And I usually, just with the isotope, I'll use the De-reverb if I have a reverberated sounding voice. And then I will use the spectral denoise and also the voice denoise version that comes with those. And those are great. What I really love about those is they allow you to analyze the sound. So this becomes even more important to capture room tone when you're using these style of noise reduction software. The other thing that people will use a lot are noise reduction identifiers in all of the programs. Adobe Audition has one. It's called noise reduction. I know Audacity has one, and Reaper has one too. In Reaper, it's called Reaffir, and it actually allows you to go in there and analyze the silence. So that's why if you haven't been coached yet, or if you haven't heard this yet, it's always recommended. And you should recommend this to anybody that you podcast with, to capture some room tone so that you can play with just the room tone or just the sound of the microphones by themselves with your audio interface, with the computer buzz. So if you're going to be sitting next to your laptop while you're recording, there's going to be a computer buzz of your laptop. And what really sucks is when it fluctuates. It's okay. It's almost better if it just stays the same damn buzz the whole time, but it fluctuates, and that creates a different problem. But it's cool if you can capture just that computer buzz by itself, because if you can, then there's plugins that can read that computer buzz and find the exact frequency of that computer buzz and then subtract that frequency from your mix, which is magic. And that is actually less noise reduction and more like noise elimination. And since I have been using this NS1 plugin, I'm amazed because they pack in the De-reverb, they pack in everything I just talked about, the voice denoise, the spectral denoise, and a noise gate, all into one plugin that reads and analyzes your audio live, and you just turn up one knob, and it's from the Waves company. It's a really amazing plugin, and it'll change your life. And basically, it's just important to do that noise reduction again so we can get more articulation out of our voices, so that we hear less of the room our speaker's in and more of our speaker. And these are just some of the customs in podcasting, and that comes from the world of broadcasting too. We're just used to hearing our podcast audio voices nice and clear without any interference. Now, if you're doing some type of audio drama, or maybe some type of experimental podcast where you're actually talking about big open reverberated spaces, then you might want to look into intentionally capturing reverb and different sonic sound fields and stuff like that. But we're just talking about your classic podcast here. And that brings us to
Number 4, De-essers.
Okay, so if I had to pick one that I could scratch off this list and just say the 4 must-use plugins on all podcast mixes, I would probably choose the De-esser here. But that is just such a tragedy. And I feel like the De-esser is the easiest of all of these plugins to use. And it's also the most unused, probably. And it's something that I'm very sensitive to are harsh S's or sibilants. And maybe it's because my ears are sensitive to that range of frequencies that I like to reduce it. But it's just because I think it makes everything sound so much better. And so many speakers have a harsh sibilant. What a de-esser does is it works like a compressor mixed with an EQ, basically. And it compresses only the high frequencies. And we can choose where those high frequencies happen, where it's basically going to reduce the volume on a frequency specific situation. Meaning that it won't reduce the high frequencies unless those high frequencies are overly present. And that's really cool, because you could just use an EQ unit and go to these places of high frequencies that are harsh in our ears. And specifically, I'm talking about 5K or 5 kilohertz up to 8 kilohertz, probably between that 4.5 to 9 kilohertz range is where we can have some really harsh sounding S's. And I would say right in the middle, 6 6,000 hertz is a great place to think about that we want to treat. Well, you could go to your EQ unit like we just talked about, and you could completely reduce and even just completely take out the 6 hertz from your voice. And that would reduce the S's substantially, but it would also reduce a lot of the other airy, beautiful quality from all of the times while we're speaking that we're not using harsh S noises. So that actually kind of hurts the sound more than it helps it. And so when a de-esser is used, it's amazing and magic because it only applies the effect whenever the S is overly present. And it's simple. You just set the frequency that you want it to happen, and you play with the knob that controls how heavily the effect's going to work or not. And my favorite is actually the Universal Audio de-esser. It's called the Precision de-esser, and it's part of the Universal Audio pack. Universal Audio is just a huge favorite of mine, and my real favorite company as far as plugins are concerned, especially if you can get one of their PCI cards that you can install into a desktop style computer. That PCI card does all of the computing and thinking and magic for you rather than having to rely on the power of your computer. And there's something about that PCI card in conjunction with the URI effects that really take it to the top professional level. And I've compared their plugins with the real plugins that they're emulating, and they're just as crispy and buttery and warm and delicious. And I know countless audio engineers who have said the same thing. So Universal Audio is a great go-to, especially if you use it
In conjunction
with the PCI cards. But you can use the Universal Audio plugins with the audio interfaces you can buy. And when you buy a Universal Audio interface, it will come with a few free plugins. And one of them, you can choose the 1176, and then you can choose the Precision de-esser that I'm talking about. But Waves also has a really great de-esser as well. And I will leave a link to that in this episode's description, as well as a link to all of the plugins I'm going to recommend that you check out that are very affordable. And they all happen to be from Waves. But we're going to get to that now with
the last and wonderful effect on the list, limiters.
Limiters are pretty cool. A limiter is a type of compressor. Only a limiter is very aggressive, and the threshold is usually set to the very top of the audio spectrum. So that's the difference. It's the same tools. It's still using a threshold and a ratio, and it's still using gain, output, and input, but it's just a different purpose behind it. And what a limiter is there for is really to boost the whole mix together. Like if you have 2 or 3 podcast voices in your mix and you have music and you have everything, it's going to apply a dynamic range compression to the whole mix altogether. But it's also there so that it can create a very hard threshold or a hard line at the top of the audio spectrum so that you can then boost your overall volume of your whole mix too. So limiters are basically very aggressive compressors that really allow us to boost the overall volume of our mixes. And that's really what allowed people to boost volume loud enough to get it to broadcast over those radio waves. It's been a lifesaver and why limiters are so incredible. And so back to the 1176 again, you could use an 1176 as a limiter. What you would do is you would set that input to the very top, or you wouldn't really crank the input all that much. And then you would click the 20-to-1 ratio instead of the 4-to-1, which means this line that you've created, that you've drawn, you've said anytime the volume passes this line by 1 decibel, I'm going to reduce it at a 20-to-1 ratio. You're basically saying this line is impenetrable. Did I say that word right? I don't think I did.
Impenetratable.
You can't cross this line. And that's really cool because that will prevent distortion from happening, and that allows us to really get our podcast mixes at a very precise loudness. Something you hear tossed around a lot because it's important is luffs and loudness, and that's something I'm not going to get into or even talk about in this episode, but it's something that we're all trying to achieve the right loudness for our platforms. We're trying to give our MP3s to our podcast hosts at the right loudness. There's all these different ways that you can achieve it. You can actually get it almost perfect. But usually, if you apply a limiter and you put a nice light limiting setting on, that's going to take care of the loudness for you. It's going to be just fancy and nice. And my favorite limiter, again, is the URI Precision limiter. And then from the Waves bundle, I really like the L2 limiter. I'm an old school guy, it's just a classic limiter, but there's lots of stereo limiters you can use. But I would really recommend the L2. And so now those are the 5 plugins. I'll refresh them and I'll tell you again where you can find them all for a decent price. So the first one is Compressor, and this is on every podcast mix. The compressor is going to be applied to the voices, any voice you have, and so will your EQ, which is number 2, and so will your noise reduction, which is number 3, and so will your gates, which is number 4. So all 4 of those effects or those plugins will be applied to every track, individual voice that you have on your mix. That's important to know because you'll have different EQ settings for each different speaker. You'll have different noise reduction settings for different speakers too, especially if you're in different locations or you're recording remotely. And so you're going to want to put those effects on each voice. But then the limiter is an effect that you put on the master channel or the LR or the stereo channel, sometimes also called the stereo bus. That's where you're going to put the limiter plugin because it's going to actually limit the whole mix. And that's just basically kind of understanding sort of the signal flow of how audio boards work and how kind of our DAWs are working. All of our tracks that we set up and record on, they have a final destination. And their final destination is the LR or the stereo bus. And it has a left and a right. And so you'll see it'll say master or it'll say LR. And if you don't see it, you can usually create it in whatever digital audio workstation you're in. That gives us one final ability to sort of see what the overall left and right volume level of our podcast looks like and sounds like and where it is on the volume spectrum. And that gives us right there, just by looking at it, we can see, oh, that's too quiet. We want to see that those volume meters going almost to the very top of that meter so that we get a nice fat mix. And so on that stereo channel, that's where we're going to add the limiter. And when we add a limiter and we just put like a medium, a very light limiter on there on that master channel, we're going to have a nice loudness and we won't really have to worry about the complexities of LUFS, at least when we're getting going. And so you would use those in every single mix, and a great place, a great destination you can go to really up your game as far as that goes is Waves. And it's just like it sounds, an ocean wave, waves.com. I'll leave the link for all of these specific effects I'm talking about. And Waves is constantly doing holiday sales and different types of buy one, get one free plugins. And I think most of these you can get for around $30. So to get all 5 of them, yes, you might be looking at $150, but it'd be the best $150 you will ever spend on your podcast because that NS1 noise reduction will make it sound so nice, so much cleaner, and it's so easy to use. And a compressor, you want to sound nice and fat and juicy and warm, so take some time to learn how how compressors work so you can sound really broadcast ready and sexy with your podcast. The information's there for you to learn. And we have also some really cool EQ videos on our channel that you should definitely go check out. We're actually show you some of the EQ spectrums on a very easy to understand parametric 7-band EQ. And I will leave the links to the compressor video and to the 2 EQ videos right here where you're listening to this episode. And also, if you really are interested in becoming a very amazing podcast editor, maybe you're even considering doing it for a job, which a lot of people are starting to consider because you can make upwards of $100 an hour right out of the gates if you know what you're doing and you know how to market yourself and you can teach yourself to edit quick enough and efficiently enough. I have a podcast course that I put together that I'm continually working on and updating. And as a student, you get access to the lifetime updates. And it's called Reaper for podcasters. And I've chosen Reaper as my go-to DAW or audio editing software for independent podcasters because it has all of the bells and whistles. It's really easy to use and understand. And it's strikingly similar to Pro Tools in ways that makes me happy. But it's also very affordable. Many people just continue to always use it for free because it's free for 60 days. And if you don't want to be annoyed by the constant reminder that you're using the free version, then it's a one-time $60 after that. And I think just ethically and morally, it's such a great program. You just got to pay for it. But it's a one-time $60 as compared to Pro Tools, which is $600. So if you want to learn how to use Reaper the way that professional podcast editors do, I have that course. It's called Reaper for Podcasters. You can go to podcastingsmart.com/R4P, stands for Reaper for Podcasters with the number 4. And I will also leave that link in the description where you're listening to this episode as well. And if you have any more questions about podcast editing, maybe I sparked your curiosity with that, like, wait a minute, $100 an hour, you're kidding me. Yeah, actually, very realistically out the gates, I would say 50 is extremely realistic. hit me up. I'm on Twitter at Pod Sound School. You can DM me there. Also, you can comment on our YouTube channel. I respond to those comments probably even more than Twitter. And you can find Veronica at Pod Sound School on Instagram. She's more commonly over there. And until next episode, do let me know if you enjoyed this one by leaving a review here or tapping on the stars. If you're on Spotify, they just got the star feature. So hit a couple of those stars. Let's see what that does to our pod. We love you. We're here to see your podcast be a wild success. So please reach out and let us know how we can help. We make content for you. We get inspired by what you need help with. And we're constantly trying to get into your mind to figure out what we can do to help you more. So help us help you.
And you gotta learn about compression a little bit, or you're not gonna sound warm and juicy.
All right. Until next time, happy casting.